Okay, folks, little different video here for you guys in the honors class. I've given you an outline of what is in the video. I'd like you to take notes. You're probably going to want to use a separate sheet of paper because you're going to run out of room and probably going to be very difficult to organize it otherwise. So you may want to stop right now, create the outline into something bigger. The outline is also posted on Classroom so that you can um, print it out if you want to make the margins bigger or whatever to give yourself some more room to write. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the first civilizations, the cities, states, and the unequal societies that grew up from over about a course of 3,000 years around the world from 3,500 BCE to around 500 BCE. And you can see the map shows you where these occurred. We're going to talk briefly about all of them, and then we will come back later on in the week and the weeks after, and take some of these individually. Some of them, the American ones, we will not get to probably till January, as they come up in the chronology of time. Okay, so something new, emergence of civilization. So, what is a civilization? A new type of human society made possible by the immense productivity of the Neolithic agricultural revolution. It's simply a complex society. Characteristics: large population. The cities have thousands of inhabitants. You have powerful leaders who can make people do what they want. Job specialization, which we've talked about pretty uh, extensively. Social classes, and these social classes were unequal. The people doing most of the work and the predominance of the people are on the lower end, and the top of the social classes are people like kings and soldiers, who maybe aren't doing as much of a contribution to society. There's large scale architecture, pyramids, what are known as ziggurats, other huge buildings characterized by the development of writing, calendars, and warfare becomes much more prominent or prevalent. Okay, so some of the first civilizations. We're going to start with the earliest, which emerged in Sumer, which is in southern Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq, between 3,500 and 3,000 BCE. This is the home of the first written language. Later, Egyptian civilization appears in the Nile River Valley in northeast Africa, and then a smaller Nubian civilization to its south at about the same time in this area we know as the Fertile Crescent. Again, we're going to get into it in more detail later in class. Then you have Norte Chico, which is in central coastal Peru. This is kind of the great 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 grandfather of the Incas, who you're probably familiar with. Emerged between 3000 and 1800 BCE. There was as many as 25 urban centers, small cities and towns. It differed in several ways from Mesopotamia and Egypt. Um, didn't have the large, powerful empires and large, powerful central governments, and didn't really have a formalized system of writing, though they're starting to think that the quipu, which was a way of record keeping, really was their system of writing. Very self contained. The only thing they imported from outside was maize, which came from Mesoamerica, but they weren't trading directly. It was more of a systematic trade with them, where through layers and middlemen. Okay. Indus Valley Civilization, which is what we're going to talk about after we do the Middle East. In the Indus and Saraswati valleys of present day Pakistan arose between 3000 and 2000. Very elaborate planned cities, standardized weights and measures, architectural styles, and brick sizes are all standardized. They have a written script, but we can't figure it out. We don't have that key like we did with some of the others, hieroglyphics and that all of a sudden helped us figure it out. So their language remains undeciphered. Unlike other civilizations, they generated no palaces, temples, elaborate graves, no evidence of kings or warrior classes. Maybe if we ever figure out the language, we might be able to figure out how their societies ran a little better. Scholars are very uncertain about how it was organized because we don't have access to the language. Many theories include there were small republics, or maybe a priest class ruling, or maybe an early form of the caste system, which we will talk about when we get to India. Environmental degradation led to the collapse of this civilization. There's some thought that there was maybe some earthquakes that shifted the river valleys away from it, and therefore there wasn't enough water and they couldn't keep going. Several aspects of the culture shaped the later Indian societies, and again, we'll get into that in some detail down the road. And finally, we have China. 2200 BC, the first civilization takes place in China, and it was defined by the ideal of a centralized state. The Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties enlarged the Chinese state. The ruler or the emperor is the son of heaven. He's supposed to be an intermediate between heaven and earth. They have an early written language with oracle bones, which you see on the bottom left. They are the early documents, and China has maintained an impressive cultural continuity into modern times. We're going to be watching a video a little later on that when we come around to China during the period of the first emperor. And one of the quotes from the video is the Chinese were there at the beginning and they're still going strong. Okay. Finally, you have the Olmecs, who come a great deal later, around 1200. They're the first civilization of what we know as Central America. Their cities arose from competing chiefdoms, produce elaborate ceremonial centers. They create the first written language in the Americas around 900 BCE. Their culture later influences much of Mesoamerica, including the Maya, Teotihuacan, and eventually the Aztecs. And this is an example of the giant heads that they left behind. Nobody's really sure what they're about. Okay. There are several other smaller civilizations. You have the Nubian Civilization, which is south of Egypt along the Nile, distinctive and independent from Egypt. And then you have Sanjidui in China, which arose separately from the more well-known Shang dynasty. Okay, some questions about the origins of these. All of the first civilizations had their roots in the agricultural revolution. So as agriculture is adopted, you begin to have civilizations develop. They usually developed from earlier competing chiefdoms of hunter-gatherers. Some already had social ranks and some form of economic specialization. Very gradual process and evolutionary. They worked on it over time. Okay, so why did some of the chiefdoms develop into civilizations and others do not? One argument is the need for large-scale or to organize large-scale irrigation projects could have been this. And these irrigation projects begin long before you really have civilization. Okay. Another argument is the needs of elite groups, warfare, and trade also play roles. And then you have historian Robert Caniero's argument is that population density creates competition, especially when agricultural land was limited, and that leads to the gradual steps to civilization. You got to do it better if you want to be in charge. Okay. Creation of the first civilization was quick by world history standards, but it was an unconscious undertaking for those involved. They didn't really realize they were creating civilizations. It just happened out of necessity. And all of them relied on highly productive agriculture. Okay. And it's really, there's a secondary revolution to the Neolithic revolution. It's an urban revolution. You have the development of cities, some major ones in each of the places. Uruk, which is in Sumer, had a population of as many as 50,000 people. You have a picture of the ruins of it, and had a ziggurat, which is their version of a temple, at the center of the city. Mohenjo-Daro, which you see a picture of the ruins on the right also. They had 2 to 3 story buildings. They had indoor plumbing, sewers. Everything's laid out in a grid pattern. As mentioned before, they had a standardized houses. They had a huge public bath, and in the center you see the high tower there. That is their walled citadel or fort. We might think of it as a castle today. Okay, Teotihuacan, which later evolves into Mexico City. By 1000 BC, there's 200,000 people living there. All of these cities are home to culture, art, architecture, literature, ritual and religion, and markets. And they're also very impersonal. Someone moving there from the outer regions is probably going to be a little overwhelmed at the start. Okay. Cities are the most distinctive features of the first civilizations. Their scale and layout and specialized industries would have impressed people from outside. They were the heart of all of the first civilizations because they were political and administrative capitals, centers for cultural production, places for trade, centers of manufacturing. They produced new societies that are much more specialized, but also much more unequal, or have a greater inequality, maybe is a better way to state that. Okay. Why does equality go away? I mean, hunter-gatherers were very much an egalitarian, very equal society. Social classes were created by job specialization. The more respected or impressed by the things you did, the more likely you were going to have a higher status. Um, Unequal, and they were all unequal and hierarchical. You had the rich at the top, the poor at the bottom. And law and punishment was often determined by your class. If you harmed somebody in your same class, your punishment was different if you harmed somebody in a class above you. And this creates a privileged class of nobility, which lasts really to today. Okay, a little bit more about the hierarchies. Okay, vast inequalities of wealth, status, and power. As they multiplied and magnified the inequalities that already existed. As more people live together, the inequalities become more magnified. Okay, new levels of inequality represent one of the major turning points in social history of humankind. Okay, the upper classes are very wealthy. They don't have to work in the fields. They have the finest of everything. They have all the good jobs and are frequently distinguished from others by their housing, clothing, how they're buried, and their treatment under the law. Okay? Commoners, the free people, form the majority of the population, and they include all the people that make stuff, the lower level officials, soldiers and police, servants and farmers. Their surplus production was appropriated to support the upper class. Some members of these classes became resentful of this. And then finally at the bottom you have the slaves. Okay? Slavery and civilization have emerged together. First generation slaves were often prisoners of war, criminals, or debtors. They worked in all the heavy labor jobs, also in homes and shops. More rarely they were sacrificed. And it varied from place to place, and it was very different from the race-based slavery of today, of the American variety that grew up out of the slave trade that you learned about in your 7th and 8th grade classes. Okay. You also had a hierarchy of gender. Civilizations everywhere determined the earlier and more equal relationships between men and women. Women in horticultural or farming societies remained relatively equal to men, but patriarchy gradually emerged in these first civilizations. Patriarchy just means dominance by men. As agriculture becomes more intensive and harder physically, male labor begins to take over. Developed in areas without the plow also, but a lot of it was agriculture. And a lot of it, according to David Christian, who is one of the major historians of this period, declining position of women was a product of the growing social complexity. The association of women with nature because of their role in reproduction may also have played a part. Warfare may also have contributed in part to this because the men were the soldiers. Private property and commerce may have also played a role. Okay. Then what brings us to the rise of the state. And one of the big factors of the rise of the state is what's known as coercion and consent. Coercion is simply making someone do something. Consent is people agreeing to it. Okay? The state did a lot of stuff in the first civilization. They organized the irrigation systems. They were the judge and juries. Okay? They adjudicated conflicts and they provided defense. Also served the needs of the upper classes by protecting their privileges, requiring farmers to give up a portion of their stuff to support the city people, and they could demand labor for large public projects. Okay, state frequently uses force to secure its will. Force is not always necessary, but because the state often claimed that its authority was normal, natural, and ordained by the gods. You get this concept of divine right rule. The gods said, I should be in charge. And deference to religion restrained and even undermines the right to rule of Chinese emperors by the mandate of heaven. Okay? Writing and accounting systems. Okay, that's basically why writing developed, was to keep track of stuff. Okay, writing provided support for the state and emerged in all of the first civilizations. It sustained them by defining elite status. Those who could read and write, obviously had more prestige. Allowing some commoners to join in the elite because they learned how to read. Was a means of propaganda, as it still is today. Provides a mean for accurate accounts, complex calendars, weights, and measures. Okay, serve functions beyond the state. Literature, philosophy, astronomy, all this becomes important, and sometimes it threatens rulers. Okay. Finally, you have the grandeur of the kings. Okay, the king becomes the source of state authority. He's often raised to somewhat the level of a god. They build monumental residences, these huge palaces and temples like the Great Pyramids. They dress in luxurious fabrics and and they have very elaborate burials. Again, the pyramids. Okay, um, so a lot happens in this civilization period, and there's a lot of things going on. So what I want you to do is make sure your outline and notes are detailed and complete, and then complete the Google form on Google Classroom.